Welcome, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. I'm really honored and excited tonight to be joined by Margaret Randall and Mariana Mcdonald. We're celebrating Dominga Rescues the Flag, which is a work of history and so much more. So I want to introduce our co-authors this evening and give them an opportunity to speak more about themselves, but I'm going to tell you their bios first. So on my right, she may be on your left, depending on how you're looking at the screen, is Margaret Randall. Margaret is a poet, essayist, oral historian, translator, photographer, and social activist. She has published more than 120 books of poetry, essays, and oral history. 120. Randall lived in Latin America for 23 years, Mexico, Cuba, and Nicaragua. In 2019, she was given the Poet of Two Hemispheres Award by Poesia in Paralelo Cero in Quito, Ecuador. You can tell that I don't speak Spanish, I'm sorry. And that same year, Cuba's Casa de las Americas awarded her its prestigious Haiti Santa Maria Medal. Her memoir, titled I Never Left Home, Poet, Feminist, Revolutionary, was published by Duke University Press this year. She lives in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So welcome, Margaret. Margaret is joined by Mariana Mcdonald, who is known to all of our friends in Atlanta, as a poet, a writer, a scientist, and an activist. Her literary work has appeared widely, including poetry in Crab Orchard Review and the New Verse News, fiction in So to Speak and Cobalt, and creative nonfiction in Long Ridge Review and Herstory. She is co-author and editor of Dominga Rescues the Flag. She was lead editor of Oscar Lopez Rivera's award-winning bilingual memoir, Cartas a Karina. Mcdonald has published over 100 scientific and educational articles and received numerous awards for her public health work. She lives in Decatur, Georgia. We are thrilled to have you both here, and I want to let folks know who are watching at home that I see you're already engaged in the chat, which is wonderful. Continue to put your comments in there. It is not disruptive. You are welcome to chat at any time. Say what you're enjoying. You also will see at the center of your screen two very important buttons. One is the green button where you can buy Dominga Rescues the Flag. We want to make sure that you know that you can purchase that from Charis Books tonight. And then underneath that is the Ask a Question button. That's where you can put your question in the chat, but you also can put it in the center. And towards the end of the event, I'll be popping back up to ask your community questions to our co-authors. So please make yourselves at home. We're very glad you're here. And I'm going to hand it over to Mariana.
Terrific. Thank you so much, ER. And I also want to thank Sarah and Artricia, all of the folks at Charis Books, for hosting this important event during Puerto Rican Heritage Month. And we just want to let you know what we're going to be doing tonight. We're going to start off with me providing some background on Dominga's Puerto Rico and Puerto Rico today. And then Margaret will talk about documenting Dominga's story, how that was done. And then both Margaret and I will read from Dominga Rescues the Flag. And then we'll do question and answers with ER. Dominga's Puerto Rico and Puerto Rico today. Dominga de la Cruz was a Black working-class woman born on April 22nd, 1909 in Ponce, Puerto Rico. It was the time of the entrenchment and consolidation of U.S. colonial control of Puerto Rico, just 11 years after the U.S. invasion of the island on July 25th, 1898. Dominga was born into the poverty and hardship that blanketed the whole island. Dominga suffered this poverty directly and profoundly. Her two daughters died of malnutrition. She questioned how and why this should happen, why such horrible things happened to her, and that questioning led her to the nationalist movement. The Nationalists. Opposition to U.S. presence in Puerto Rico developed rapidly under the leadership of a brilliant young Harvard-educated Black man from Ponce, Pedro Albizu Campos, who was elected head of the Nationalist Party in the 1920s and was the leading representative and voice of the independence movement for decades. Campos declared, "The Yankees have been at war against the Puerto Rican nation and have never acquired the right to anything in Puerto Rico, nor is there any legal government in Puerto Rico, and this is incontestable. One would have to knock to pieces all the international rights of the world to validate the invasion of the U.S. in Puerto Rico and the present military occupation of our national territory." Dominga de la Cruz was a bright, bold, and daring young woman who joined the Nationalist Party in 1933 at age 24 and became a leading activist. She was one of the party's most prominent women members and a champion of women's rights, pushing for women's full incorporation into the national liberation struggle. Dominga was drawn to Albizu's leadership, his character, and eloquence, and in the 1930s she became a protege of the great nationalist leader. She even baptized him by giving him the nickname El Maestro, the teacher, which stuck. The 1930s was a time of great social upheaval in Puerto Rico. The nationalist movement grew as people witnessed the fiery embodiment of Puerto Rican consciousness, which was Albizu Campos. His insistence on Puerto Rico's independence struck a resonant chord in the Puerto Rican people who suffered extreme poverty and degradation. It was also a time of great repression. The U.S. feared the nationalist response to the island's growing crisis. Puerto Rico's U.S.-appointed Governor Blanton Winship made no attempt to conceal plans to wage war against the nationalists. In 1936, Winship arrested the top Nationalist Party leaders, including Albizu Campos, on trumped-up charges of seditious conspiracy. The Ponce Massacre, March 21st, 1937. The demonstration in Ponce that Palm Sunday in 1937 was called by the Nationalists to protest the imprisonment of their leaders and to commemorate the end of slavery 100 years prior. Despite an island-wide ban on demonstrations, pardon me, I don't think it was 100 years, but it was in the century before. Despite an island-wide ban on demonstrations, the mayor of Ponce granted a permit only to renege it on Winship's orders shortly before the march was to begin. The Nationalists decided the demonstration would go on, permit or no. As the procession began, a single bullet fired into the crowd quickly turned into a barrage, and for nearly 15 minutes, U.S.-supported troops fired on the marchers, the nationalists, and passers-by leaving church that Palm Sunday. The horror of those minutes was indelibly written on the pages of Puerto Rican history and the history of the Americas. Even those who had no qualms about the U.S. occupation of Puerto Rico had to admit it was a massacre. Dominga's daring rescue of the Puerto Rican flag in the midst of machine gun fire that Sunday won her a place in history, as well as persecution and exile. The level of persecution she faced in Puerto Rico became life-threatening, and Dominga was forced into exile in Mexico. There she lived and fought until once again political repression forced her to move, this time to Cuba in 1962, where she was welcomed with open arms. Dominga was a cultural worker in Cuba for many years, often giving poetry recitals as she had done in Puerto Rico. Her talent and skills as a declamadora, or performer of poetry, were renowned, and brought her adoring audiences all over the world. Dominga de la Cruz died in Havana, Cuba on November 25th, 1981, at the age of 72. Puerto Rico today. Puerto Rico remains a U.S. colony today, still reeling from the destruction of Hurricane Maria, along with a series of damaging earthquakes from last December through January 2020, and an uncontrolled coronavirus pandemic. After Hurricane Maria, people in Puerto Rico were without electrical power and water for over a year, and much of Maria's damage persists to this day. The U.S. and colonial governments claimed only a few people had died in the hurricane, but studies revealed that between 3,000 and 4,645 people perished in the wake of the hurricane and the government's shamefully incompetent response. The disaster of Maria and the U.S. government's paper towel tossing reaction to it followed decades of damaging colonial policies like the Jones Act and reckless vulture capital investment practices that gave rise to full-blown economic disaster, leaving Puerto Rico with over $70 billion in unpayable and odious debt. The U.S. Congress's response to worried investors was the passage in 2016 of PROMESA, which installed an unelected fiscal control board known as the Junta to oversee restructuring of the debt. But in practice, the Junta has just focused on measures that include cuts in pensions, the closure of hundreds of schools, reduction of basic social and health services, and other assaults on the island's people. In the midst of it all, the Puerto Rican people continue to carry on the fight for freedom from colonial domination. There have been important victories. A broad united front led the long battle to get the U.S. Navy out of Vieques, ending 50 plus years of the U.S. Navy using Vieques for bombing practice, and they forced the Navy's exit on May 1st, 2003. A similar united front was also built in the campaign to win the release of political prisoner Oscar Lopez Rivera on May 17, 2017. And in July 2019, a united Puerto Rico took to the streets for weeks, successfully demanding the ouster of corrupt Governor Ricky Rosselló. These victories involve many sectors and movements in Puerto Rico in addition to the independence movement. Among these are united efforts of students and women, environmentalists, agroecologists, LGBTQ people, diverse cultural sectors, and Boricuas of African descent. The Afro-descendant movement has grown in Puerto Rico and throughout the Americas. In Puerto Rico, it exalts the ancestors of today's movements, those Afro-Boricua patriots who left a mark on Puerto Rican history, like Pedro Albizu Campos and Dominga de la Cruz. I had the great honor and privilege of meeting Dominga in the summer of 1978 when Margaret introduced us and I first learned about Dominga's story. When I asked her then about her action and her bravery, Dominga's answer was simple: I did my duty. This is the context of Dominga's story. It's a story of resistance, which is the pulse beat of Puerto Rican history. Dominga de la Cruz leaping into the gunfire to retrieve the Puerto Rican flag is Puerto Rico in struggle. And now we'll hear from Margaret about documenting Dominga's story.
Thanks so much, Mariana. Thanks, ER. Thanks to all of you at Charis Books. I think it's worth mentioning that We're really proud of everyone in Georgia these days. That was a victory in these times when it's really hard to find one. That was really a great summary of Puerto Rico at the time that Dominga was active, and also today. It's something that I think that I want to say that I'm very glad that you, Mariana, were able to add that to this book. This is a book, as you know, that I did many, many years ago, only in Spanish, and I think bringing it up to date like you did with your introduction and your epilogue really makes it not only wonderful reading. Dominga's story is such a great story, but also really just something very valuable for us to know about today. I lived in Cuba from the fall of 1969 through the end of 1980. Dominga called me on the telephone one day. I think she must have gotten my number somewhere, perhaps from my friend Flavia Rivera, who was the representative of Maribras in Cuba at that time. Dominga said she'd seen my first book about Cuban Women Now. So this must have been after 1972, when the Cuban edition of that book appeared. She knew that I did oral history. She asked if I would be interested in recording her story. She said she was tired of being referred to as, quote, the woman who picked up the flag at the Ponce Massacre. She said she had a whole life before and after that moment, and she wanted people to know about it. Of course, I was thrilled. I went to her apartment to meet her. We began getting to know one another, and then we made a schedule for regular visits. I used a tape recorder, one of those old clunky ones that we had back then. I taped all our conversations, transcribed them, and, as was my policy with all of my oral history work, gave the transcripts to those I interviewed for feedback, corrections, and so forth. I don't really remember how many sessions we had, but I'm thinking at least 20. I know that my son Gregory was still young back then, maybe 12 or 13, and he sometimes came with me, which was why I dedicate the book to him. I realized how important it would be for young people, especially, to learn this history that was so often absent from our textbooks. And at least once I invited my photography mentor, Ramon Martinez Grandal, we called him Grandal, to come along with me, which was when he took the series of images that appear in the original edition of the book, published by Huracan in Rio Piedras, Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, none of those tapes exist now, and this is something that's happened with almost all of my oral history work. Back then, I often had to use tapes again and again because I didn't have enough of them, and it wasn't possible to buy them in Cuba at the time. I remember being very impressed by Dominga, her humility, her selflessness, the fact that she had actually lost 2 children to hunger. That must have been the first time someone told me that. And I also just plain liked her. She had a great sense of humor. I think it's important to point out that Dominga was not a passive teller of her story. She was interested in being involved not only in the telling, but in how I was approaching the telling. When she read the transcript, she would make interesting comments and suggestions. She was curious about the methodology involved in doing oral history, about technology, and asked a lot of questions about those things as well. I remember each session as being around 2 or 3 hours long. I'd listen and record, occasionally asking a question, until she got tired. Her story naturally divided itself into sections, different moments in her life, her affiliation with Pedro Albizu Campos, and her obvious reverence for him, her life as a mother, her life as a worker, and finally her exile in Cuba, always mentioned with deep gratitude to the Cuban Revolution for having given her safe haven. Of course, that was something that we had in common because Cuba had given safe haven as well to my family and myself. I also remember Dominga's generosity. She always brewed fresh coffee when I appeared. Thinking back, I imagine that she may have had access to the special store for foreigners that existed in those years. Or maybe not. I'd rejected that special ration book, so only had the usual Cuban rations. Still, coffee was always at a premium, and it was noteworthy that she never failed to offer it. That Latin American hospitality, notable even in homes that had only the barest necessities. So I'll hand it back to you, Mariana.
Okay. Well, and I'm going to hand it back to you because now what we're going to do is share a little bit of the actual book. And right.
Yeah, I had forgotten that I was going to go first for this part. So I'll read the first few pages of Dominga's testimony as I recorded it so many years ago, and as it now appears again in this book. Dominga started by telling me, and the rest is her voice speaking. You might not believe it, but it seems to me I didn't have much of a childhood or even youth. I was born mature. I don't know if you get what I mean. I was born old. I don't remember much of my youth, just the struggles, and the same with my childhood. My parents died young. I must have been 8 or 9 years old. I can't even remember their faces. There were 6 of us in all, and I was one of the youngest. My brothers and I were farmed out to different families to be raised. I was lucky enough to stay at least for a while with 2 families who were friends of ours. They were pretty politicized people for that time. They wanted their country to be independent, even though they were sort of bourgeois. Of course, at the time, the petty and grand bourgeoisie wanted the island to be independent so they could get even richer off the sweat of the workers. I'm a working class woman born in the Buenos Aires district of Ponce on April 22nd, 1909. A worker, in spite of having spent a few years in homes that were better off economically after the deaths of my parents. They died almost together. My father, I think from some disease of the kidneys, and since they were an old-fashioned couple and neither could live without the other, when her husband died, my mother forgot about us and went and died too. I was raised away from all the rest of my remaining family. They took me to stay with my godmother, a woman who had married a Spaniard and who, I guess you could say, was pretty cultured. She took on prodigies among the young people at the time, always went to hear promising artists, attended the theater, gave gifts to the principal artists. So I grew up among all of that. I used to hear her play the piano. She played quite well. And from the time I was little, I would listen to the work she played. I listened to the older girls when they gathered and recited, and so as a little girl, I became aware of the art of reciting. Maybe that's why I liked it, why I still like it so much. My grandmother had a library where I could choose books by the best poets, like Ramón de Campoamor, Victor Hugo. I read the Contemplations by Victor Hugo when I was still pretty small, but I understood a bit of it. They used to go away in the hot season, July and August, to a beautiful place in the country. I liked nature. I liked to see the trees, the river, everything, as if I could understand it somehow. I learned a couple of poems of Juan de Dios Pesa, the Mexican poet, and when I was alone and nobody could hear, I would recite them. My audience was the river, the trees swept by the wind. That was my favorite audience. I went to school at that time, but not for long. I was bored. The teacher, the discipline, they said later, excuse me for saying this, but they told me I was rebellious because I was intelligent. I don't know about that, but I was bored. I liked poems and such best, not arithmetic. Also, because of the Yankee influence in Ponce, the schools began to have mixed classes with boys and girls together. There were problems with that because of people's backgrounds and the imposition of a strange culture without explanation. Of course, it was the girls who were kept home from school. I got to the 4th grade and they took me out. After that, I studied at home, but for a very short time. My grandmother and her husband died shortly after that. It was a confusing time, but I understand more about it now. The issue of North American imperialism was in the air. I can understand it now. They had a coffee plantation and it was ruined. I later heard Don Albizu explain those setbacks for my people. I believe the North Americans devalued the dollar and people were ruined because they didn't listen to Don Rosendo Matenzo Cinturon when he said, "Don't sell the earth, don't sell the land." Maybe they didn't pay attention because they wanted to get out of debt, and that brought on the fiasco of that first stage in Puerto Rico. In the midst of all that, the coffee disaster, the death of that family, I went to live with my brothers, poor people who raised pigs and so forth. I spent my time working with all that. I got malaria because I was not used to that kind of life, and the change was so abrupt. I would get the chills out in the fields and lie down on the ground until they went away. By chance, because of the deaths of my parents, I had lived away from that reality for a time. But that reality is the norm in our countries. How many women, how many men are born and die in that life? How many? That's why I said I don't really remember having a childhood, just pieces of one. So later in the book, Dominga goes on to say, "That's how I grew up, matured, became a young lady, as they say in Puerto Rico, and I began to work in the factories, in workshops where they made embroidered blouses. I worked with my older sister. Puerto Rico is famous for its embroidery, very fine work that is possible, as in so many other so-called underdeveloped countries, because the workforce is practically enslaved. But you can't imagine what that work was like. Day after day, we worked by the light of a paraffin lamp until 2 a.m, and we were badly fed. I was in Mayaguez with my sister, practically the only place I could go. I think Mayaguez had more tuberculosis than any other city because there was no food and there was a lot of that needlework. We were working in those conditions when Albizu Campos began to making things clear. At that time, I still didn't have. No, I didn't know. It's not that I wasn't there, but I just didn't know what the class struggle was. It wasn't any picnic to work till midnight by lamplight for the sweatshops. You see, we did the work at home. They brought us the lots of work, and we got paid less because the intermediary who bought the lots and had us do the work collected a commission. We suffered double exploitation. I didn't understand the class struggle, but I sure understood my own misery. Sure, maybe I thought it was my problem, but I was rebellious by inclination, and I didn't want to go on working there. So they took me to a cigar factory where some friends of my sister were working. I knew how to read, and they said I read pretty well for being so young, because our language was a little garbled at that time, no? And I read pretty well. So I went to read to the workers in a chinchal, as they called it, a cigar factory. All the terrible things that happened to women at that time happened to me too. A woman had to find a husband to be able to eat. So I found mine and got married. Don't think I loved him. No way. I had a good education, maybe too good in some ways. When I was a little girl, they talked about a lot of things that were maybe too lofty for me. So I was a little fussy, not to find a rich man or even a well-off one. No, no, no. The sexual thing wasn't very clear for me. That's it. For me, it was as if it didn't exist. Maybe you'll think it's incredible, but that's the way it was. Now I had to find a man, because married or not, I had to get help to get by financially. I didn't understand why things were that way. I just followed the pattern without understanding. Although I did rebel, that's for sure. I don't know against what, but I rebelled. So that's what I wanted to share of Dominga's story in her voice. There's a lot more, of course, but I do want people to buy the book, so I'm not going to give any more away. Although to answer questions later if there are any. So back to you now, Mariana.
Okay, and I just want to show people the cover of the book, which you can get from Charis, and give a shout out to the cover artist, Jane Norling, who I think is on tonight, and also to thank and give a shout out to Christina Mills, who did the translation of Dominga's story from Spanish to English. So I'm going to read from 5 chapters or 4 chapters later from the chapter about what took place in Ponce. And it's called, "So I Picked Up the Flag, All Covered with Blood, and Went On With It." It was Palm Sunday of the year 1937. We left Mayaguez in rented buses. I remember they were red. Through the bus windows, we saw other red buses pass by very close, the police buses, and the police were smiling as they went by. Of course, they knew what was about to happen, but we did not. The ride from Mayaguez to Ponce took about 2 hours. When we arrived, we met in a house. We saw police there too, on all sides, but we were used to that, to the police coming in and searching our houses. They had raided my house twice since Albizu had been in jail. They went through everything. We gathered in the offices of the Nationalist Council. It was 1 p.m. We saw our leaders arguing, coming and going. We learned later that they'd gone to the mayor's office because he had given permission for the demonstration that day, and a quarter of an hour beforehand, he ordered the permit suspended. Finally, our leaders gave the order and we all set out, women as well as men. At first, it was agreed that the women would not go out, but later they decided we would. Even today, Margaret, we have to fight for our right to struggle. When we formed ranks in the street, the police were there too in the order they had planned beforehand. Then we were on our way with our flags and all, and a young girl said to me, "Hi, Dominga, look at their guns." Poor thing, she was really scared. I told her, "Yes, I see them, but we have to go forward." I don't mean to claim that I wasn't afraid, Margaret. Maybe I was, but more than anything, I was angry. So we went ahead, the cadets of Ponce in front, those of Mayaguez next, and then the women, first those of Ponce and then us with our flags. They ordered the hymn La Borinqueña to be played, and we stood at attention when we heard it. Then Cadet Lopez de Vitoria said, "Eyes front, ready, forward, march." When he said this, he didn't know what was before us. We marched, and all the guns began to fire. I still don't know, Mark, on that day why I wasn't killed. I was out in the open, and I heard it when they released the safety catches on the machine guns. At that moment, I looked and I saw a lot of people throw themselves on the ground because from a distance they were throwing tear gas bombs. I don't know where they came from. I felt strangled as the bullets kept coming. The people in front kept falling. I didn't look at the police or who was firing. I was running to save myself when I see someone cross and fall wounded. And in that second, I see the flag on the ground. So I picked up the flag, all covered with blood, and went on with it. I picked it up and went on my way. And then, before our eyes, the dead, torn to pieces at our feet, because they say they're used there for the first time those explosive shells that Mussolini had. A little girl who came to see the demonstration with her parents died too. She was ripped apart by a bullet. Apart from the 22 dead, there were many wounded. One of them, a young man, wrote on a wall with his blood, "Long live the Republic, down with the assassins." We spent the whole afternoon of the massacre in the police station. The entire people were united behind us. Later, there was the Hayes investigation with Mr. Hayes of the American Civil Liberties Union. My turn to testify came one day at 2 a.m. The place was packed with people from the university, intellectuals, everyone waiting for the statements. When it was my turn, I just told what I saw exactly and simply, and then I picked up the flag on my way. Then Hayes said, "And why, if you were in danger of death, did you pick up that flag instead of running for your life?" And I answered, "Because my maestro taught me that the flag of the homeland should never fall on the ground." And then he asked me, "Who is your maestro?" And I said, "Dr. Don Pedro Albizu Campos." After that, he would stand up whenever I passed by. And he wrote in the newspaper El Mundo something like this: "You have to see her, young, black, immutable in her dignity." Mr. Hayes ended his report with the words, "This was a massacre."
Thank you so much, Mariana. So shall we go to questions or?
Yeah, I think ER is probably going to be rejoining us momentarily and going through questions, any questions that have come up.
Yeah, so this is, if folks have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat or put them in the ask a question area. But I have questions. So I think, one of the things that I've really been fascinated about is since the hurricane in 2017, I think people in the mainland United States really have started to try, leftists have started to try to understand better the United States relationship to Puerto Rico. And I think there's a lot of misinformation about how to be a good ally to Puerto Rico, and particularly around the question of statehood, right? And so, this is all about, it's interesting to hear, okay, the independence movement, the nationalist movement for Puerto Rico has this very deep roots. And I think we obviously in the United States very rarely learn about this. So can you give us the update on what the nationalist movement is like today, and the question around statehood, and sort of for well-intentioned leftists in the United States, how should we be supporting the nationalist movement?
Shall I go ahead and take a crack at that?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good question, especially given that there was just an election in Puerto Rico, and there was a referendum on statehood there. And it's actually the second referendum, and there have been 5 plebiscites. None of them actually initiated and carried out by Congress. So actually, because Puerto Rico is a colony, none of these referenda or plebiscites have really had much of an impact. But definitely, the fact that in this current referendum, which was basically a yes or no to statehood, there have been some people in the United States who, and in my view, and like you were asking about, have really misinterpreted the fact that the vote was 52% for statehood, 48% against, which actually is extremely close and extremely inconclusive, because to have that great of a no vote was actually a result of the independence movement and the progressive movement in Puerto Rico having a vote no campaign for the referendum. And so the Nationalist Party per se is it still does exist in Puerto Rico, and it honors the history and the heroes and the heroines of the movement. But as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, the movement now is extremely broad and diverse, and there are many, many different elements to it. There's a strong transgender supporting movement in Puerto Rico. There also has been some horrific transgender violence, and murders. But looking at that statehood referendum and thinking it means that somehow, the good thing to do is to say we need to, in the United States, support statehood for Puerto Rico and DC, and it's kind of in the same breath, like they're the same thing. It is a tremendous mistake, and it is based in, as you noted, a real lack of understanding. And I think one of the things that happened with this election that was remarkable, first of all, just like in the United States, the participation in the election and the voting public was the greatest since 1967, just as our participation here, because, hey, it's all related, right? And this time, the so-called winner of the gubernatorial race is Pedro Pierluisi, who is in the old PNP, I can't even remember how that translates to English, but it's the most backward, conservative, pro-statehood, pro-annexation party. He won, but he only got 33% of the vote. And so what progressive people in Puerto Rico are pointing out is, look, that doesn't mean that he was voted governor. It means that 70% of the people didn't want him. And this is a carrying through of what we saw a year ago last summer, when people were just, hundreds of thousands, possibly even at some point millions of people were in the street to get rid of a corrupt governor. And the PNP, the party that won the election, is precisely that party known for its corruption. It's the same party as the governor who was ousted. So I think we have to think more critically. I think the other thing that happened in this election, one thing that happened is the elections are still not settled. Funny thing about that. The election commission, about a week after the election, discovered somewhere between 100 and 200 boxes of votes that hadn't been counted. And so I actually don't know if the election has been certified yet in PR. But one of the things that happened was there were new anti two-party system parties that were involved: the Puerto Rican Independence Party, the Movement for Citizens Victory, and also another party called Proyecto Dignidad. So this was a clear repudiation of the old two-party system in PR. And in fact, a lot of the critics of independence would say, oh, they never get any votes in the elections. Well, actually, the Puerto Rican Independence Party got 7 times the amount of votes that it usually gets. And still, yes, it was less than enough to win the elections, although a very progressive and a movement MVC candidate named Natal is most likely the winner of the mayoral race for San Juan. So that's a huge victory. But what some people are saying is, well, people are looking for options. People are looking for what Puerto Rico can do. And one of those options is independence. So people are considering that more than maybe they had, 5-10 years ago, or maybe even just a few years ago. Maria did a lot. And then the great mobilizations of the summer of 2019 also did a lot, because then the Puerto Rican people had the experience of power. So I think there are new realities that we have to be listening to and understanding and supporting here. And fundamentally, for people in the United States, I think that although this is right now been a pretty hard time to get the government to do anything, our task is to educate people about Puerto Rico and to say that we do not want the yoke of colonialism in our name on any other country, and Puerto Rico in particular. 122 years is 122 years too long.
Mariana, I have a question, because it's clear from what you're saying that the movement away from statehood is gaining traction in Puerto Rico, and people are mobilizing. And if it goes the way it has been going, at some point we'll have a referendum there where independence will probably win out. But what I would like to know is then what does that mean in terms of a colony? Because what has to happen in the United States, not on the part of progressive people here who can be educated to understand what you've just described, but what is going to happen on the part of the U.S. government to grant independence to Puerto Rico if it turns out, or when it turns out, that Puerto Rico wants independence? Does that have to be an act of Congress? Is that what it would take? I mean, would it take lobbying? And my question is really, I think you made it very clear what the people want and what the people are increasingly wanting. But what has to happen here for independence really to come to Puerto Rico?
Well, that's a very good and a very big question, and it is true that Congress is the responsible party, which is why I said before that none of those seven combination of plebiscites and referenda, they did not come from Congress. So they came from within Puerto Rico, and so I think were Congress ever to do a plebiscite that they were going to pay attention to, that itself would be a significant step. But Albizu Campos always said the idea of a plebiscite is an insult, because to ask people who are enslaved if they want to be free is ridiculous. So there's all that, no. But I think that it's a question for Congress, but it's also a question of international law, and the fight for independence has had many arenas that it's been playing out in, and one of them is the United Nations and the Decolonization Committee. And so, unfortunately, the United Nations is not necessarily, in this moment in history, always the most robust or loudest voice. But I think it's going to take a combination of, probably the U.S. ruling class is going to have to decide at some point it's not worth it. However, that would probably be in reaction to great, political and economic costs, which is kind of what happened in Vieques. Vieques is sort of a what's that expression? It's like a microcosm, because what happened with Vieques is that years of struggle and a lot of prolonged civil disobedience that got a tremendous amount of attention all over the world, that started to be, not too cool for the Navy, and they decided at a certain point that they needed to step back. Unfortunately, as is the way of the capitalist system, they never really took the steps to fix all the damage they have done in Vieques, which is just a tremendous environmental disaster. And there are, I don't know what the word is, there are many unspent shells and missiles and bombs and other dangerous things that are all over Vieques still, and that hasn't been cleaned up. So, I think that this is also, if the U.S. people can make Puerto Rico an issue that begins to cost the U.S. ruling powers more than they're willing to deal with, then that is going, just like we did in the war in Vietnam many years ago.
We did in South Africa. I mean, you mentioned international pressure, and certainly the movement to divest from South Africa did a great deal to help get away, to help the South Africans do away with apartheid. So, yeah, I guess that our role now here, if we're interested in doing something about this colony, Puerto Rico, is to raise consciousness, to continue to raise consciousness. And I hope that this book can help with that. And then, help create a movement, an international movement like the one, the divestment movement in South Africa, or others that I can think of that might put so much pressure on that something would happen. Well, thanks for that answer. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great point too, that there have been other movements that have managed to change U.S. foreign policy. So, but the U.S. people are just gobsmackingly ignorant, because we're trained to be. So people don't know, like this, one of the big things after Maria was the fact that Puerto Ricans had U.S. citizenship imposed on them in 1917, just in time for World War I drafting. People don't know that, and they don't know that Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. I actually think Puerto Ricans are Puerto Rican citizens, but the fact that that has since 1898 not been paid attention to, it does show this tremendous contradiction. It's like, okay, you want to have this colony and you've given people or imposed citizenship and you expect them to go fight in Vietnam, which they did, in Korea, which they did, and World War I and World War II, which they did. And yet, when a hurricane rips the island apart, what do you do but throw paper towels at them?
Well, but the other thing is that, you talk about imposing citizenship, but the Puerto Ricans are citizens when it comes to fighting wars, but they can't vote for a president, for example.
That's right.
So, it's second-class citizenship at best.
Exactly. And one of the comments that to me was like emblematic of where this country is at right now is I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, but a Republican legislator from somewhere was complaining the other day that, the election in the United States is not legitimate because they haven't counted all the votes from Puerto Rico yet, which, just shows a complete lack of any understanding.
Do we have any more questions from
We do. I want to ask one follow-up question, and then I'm going to ask this community member's question. But do you see any fertile ground in Puerto Rico aligning with other U.S. territories, colonies? Because places like Guam or U.S. American Samoa, places like that I think are similarly, Puerto Rico is the biggest colony, but the U.S. still has many colonies and territories that I think are similarly sort of misunderstood by mainland U.S. folks. And so I'm wondering if part of the revolutionary impulse is to actually get Americans to understand the need to divest from the whole colonial project all at once, as opposed to piecemeal.
Well, I think that the historical development of the struggle in Puerto Rico and its relationship to the struggle of Puerto Ricans in the United States and its connection with other struggles in the United States. For example, the fight against sterilization abuse in the 1970s was a fight that Helen Rodriguez Trias was the Puerto Rican pediatrician who first discovered that women in the Puerto Rican community were being sterilized against their will, against their knowledge, not even knowing. But that movement brought together Puerto Ricans, feminists, North American leftists in the 70s. And so that, I think that is something that has contributed to the reality of Puerto Rico's fight. And also, as I mentioned before, the international situation. I think you're right. And there was a book that I haven't read yet, but I've heard is good, and I've got it on order, and it's called How to Hide an Empire. And it's about just what you're talking about, that the United States has taken and has control over a number of places that it, it's just imperialism, basically. I don't know. I think it's a good question. I don't have an answer to it in terms of what kind of struggles are going on in those other places that you mentioned.
So we have two great questions for both of you. So the first one from Evie Frankel is, since we're talking about women's stories and oral histories, how did you two meet and begin working together?
Well, I can try to answer that. I mean, we've known each other for many, many years, and we've been friends and are friends. And this book that I did with Dominga was it flew off the shelves in its Spanish edition years ago. I don't even have a copy of the original Spanish. I think, Mariana, you had to get yours through interlibrary loan to
Right.
copy, etc., to make this new book. So for years, we've had the desire to republish this book, first of all, to make Dominga's story known, and through Dominga to raise consciousness about Puerto Rico, but also we've wanted it to be bilingual, so that this huge Puerto Rican community in the United States and many other people in this country who are interested in Puerto Rico but may not read Spanish could also read it. That's when years ago, Christina Mills came on board, did a great translation of the book, and then a few more years passed, and then we realized that although Dominga's story is so moving, it was kind of lost without the context of Puerto Rico today. And so then that's where you, Mariana, stepped in again and did this great job with updating it and so forth. But then we began the hardest part of all, which was to try to get the book published, either in Puerto Rico or in the United States. We did have a couple of houses in Puerto Rico that were interested in publishing the book bilingually, but almost immediately Maria happened, and those houses collapsed. So then, we were reduced to the U.S., and I should just say honestly that we probably presented the book to, I'd say, 20 publishers here in the United States, and none of them were interested, which I think reflects just a sad state of being around this island that's so close to us. I mean, it takes people, an hour to fly, without COVID, of course, from Puerto Rico to the United States. So that was when we decided to publish the book ourselves, which I must say that I did not want to do. Mariana was more enthusiastic, and Mariana really took on the brunt of that work. I have never published a book by myself since my very first book of poetry in 1959, which was a little self-published book. So I published with publishers, professionals who have distribution systems and in place, and copy editors and so forth. And I just was not willing to take on this job. And so I take my hat off to Mariana, because she just did it. She made it happen. And we enlisted Jane for this beautiful cover, and Mariana's son, who really, Andres, who really helped a lot too with the photographs and, so many different things. So it was really a collective task. And I think that it honors Puerto Rico, it honors Dominga's memory, but I also feel that it honors our long friendship, Mariana. So it came out well.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I would add to that is just that, this book has definitely been something that's connected us for 40 years. But also, I mean, remember when you came to Massachusetts for the conference that I was involved in women's health, and you and Helen Rodriguez came to that conference that we did, where basically we were trying to promote the idea of a working class approach to reproductive rights, because otherwise it was very white and bushy, basically. And Margaret, I don't know exactly how it was that you were in the States at that time, but Margaret came to that. And then when Margaret wanted to return to the United States and ran into a nasty piece of legislation called the McCarran-Walter Act, right? There was a whole campaign waged in the 80s to get them to stop harassing you and let you come home and be home with it.
Deportation order. I remember that when you mentioned Helen Rodriguez a few minutes ago, I actually had to fight back the tears because I remember
Yeah.
that. I remember her so well. She was such an extraordinary person, and I remember that conference. I think it was the Berkshire Women's History Conference that session was at, where you and I were there, and Helen, if I'm not mistaken. And I drove up. That wasn't the one you're talking about?
Well, you might have been also doing that, but our conference was called Massachusetts Childbearing Rights Conference, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I was in the States on a lecture tour. That's why I was living in Cuba at the time, and I was here on a lecture tour, and I went to a lot of those events, but one of them with Helen, and that her passing was such a loss for all of us. So, yeah, and when you mentioned just a moment ago the sterilization in the 70s of Puerto Rican women, of course, I couldn't help but think of today when we are doing that. The United States is doing that to refugees along the border, also without their consent, without their knowledge. So
right here in Georgia.
Right. So
Georgia is the epicenter of the new sterilization abuse problem, unfortunately.
I didn't know that, but so these attacks on different parts of our collective community are, they just keep happening. They keep repeating themselves over and over again, and at some point, I think we're going to be faced with having to just fight the whole thing, or we won't be here anymore to fight it. So, yeah, it's very complex and many layered.
Yeah, we have one more question here. So Rula says that she loves the above question, and her addition is, how did each of you become politicized? Do you have an origin story to share?
You go first, Margaret.
Well, I'm 84, so my origin story is way back in history. I started being politicized, I think, in New York in the 50s. And then I moved to Mexico in 1961. But my real sort of on-the-ground politicization came in 1968 when I was involved in the Mexican student movement. And in fact, when you were reading the part of Dominga's testimony where she speaks about the actual massacre of Ponce, it just brought back to me the massacre of Tlatelolco on October 2nd, 1968, when the paramilitary forces and military forces fired into a peaceful demonstration of thousands and thousands of young people, students, a peaceful demonstration. There were no arms or anything, but they fired into that for 5 hours, and 1,000 people were killed that afternoon. So, that kind of thing, I think that moment showed me the lengths that a government in power will go to prevent any kind of trouble. The Mexican government at that point was just about to host the Summer Olympics, and so they were very eager to clean up the mess of the student movement before those Olympics were a complete failure. So those were some of the things that politicized me. Then, of course, I went on to live in Cuba during the second decade of the Cuban Revolution, where I learned a lot about not just making revolution, but how you then have to do the hard work of changing society. And then I moved on to Nicaragua, as you say. And when I came back to this country, of course, my immigration case when I was ordered deported. So, there've been, I don't know that I can separate all of those events in my life. It's been sort of a continuum of just understanding more and doing what I can and learning as I go along and so forth. And I think this is a learning moment for all of us right now, because I mean, we're really in a very dangerous period. Biden and Harris won the election, but a precedent is being set by Trump that could damage the fabric of this country for generations. So now you go.
Wow. Well, I guess as I'm getting older, I'm understanding more how my family of origin forged my hatred of injustice, because I had two disabled siblings who were treated horrifically, and one of them took his own life. One of them died because people would not save his life in a institution for the so-called, for the developmentally disabled. So those things were happening for me at the same time as the women's movement and the war in Vietnam. And then I was going to be an archaeologist for a while there, a minute. And I spent some time in South Asia, and I had gone there to, study monuments. And I was there during two armed uprisings that I got in the middle of, and had to make some difficult decisions about how I would protect my own life and the life of people around me. So that was a pretty big deal. And then I decided I was going to deal with people above ground. I wasn't going to do archaeology in this life. Although, that's another discussion. But I think we have to actually start doing archaeology about our country to understand who we are. But yeah, and I became very involved in issues of health, which has been, part of my whole life. And then in 1974, I attended the Madison Square Garden event for independence of Puerto Rico, which was tens of thousands of people. It was a major event. And really from then on, I was very engaged in Latin American solidarity of various, Chile really impacted me. I spent some time in Panama, and then Puerto Rico just became central to my life. And I'm very grateful that it has remained so my whole life.
Wonderful. Well, is there anything that we didn't get to talk about the book that you want to make sure folks know, or any sort of closing remarks?
Well, just that it starts in English and then everything is in Spanish. So that is something that will hopefully make it accessible to more readers, and you all have it, and so people can get it there. And we like to think that it's a wonderful read. Dominga is, for me, when I was in 2019, I was working very intensely most of the year on this book, and I just felt like, wow, I get to spend this time with Dominga de la Cruz. And I just kind of fell in love with her. And it was great to be with her and, reading her words and just getting her energy. So hopefully the readers will have a little bit of that experience as well.
I think one of the things that I always think about this book, I've done maybe 30 books of oral history, but this one is unique in the way that Dominga's life really sort of balances between the absolutely unique and the absolutely ordinary. Here is this woman who did this heroic act. She and she, is very modest about it, but she's definitely a heroine in that respect. but she's also a poor Black woman from Puerto Rico whose children died of hunger, who read as a declamadora in the tobacco factories. That's a whole, I think, that's a whole activity that's very little known in this country, that in the tobacco factories, they have readers. Even today, there's a person who will go, who has a beautiful voice, who will be there all day long reading to the tobacco workers as they make their cigars and so forth. And so, they read the news, they read novels, they read poetry. So, you're introduced in this book to a very ordinary and also a very extraordinary woman. And I just think that makes her story really astonishing and valuable.
Yeah,
absolutely. And a lot of the people who are leaders in our movement are exactly that combination, extraordinary and very ordinary. So, and as a Black woman, I think she shows us too that tremendous fortitude and strong spirit of resistance and fighting that we see thankfully today in this country, and we see it in Puerto Rico, we see it around the world, and it's a great gift to have the voice of somebody like that.
Yeah, especially at a time when, pre-feminism, today women have a community or communities which give us collective strength and support. And Dominga had none of that.
Right.
She was this really, she had, of course, the independence movement, the nationalists. She had her political party, but as a woman, she was really quite alone, as she explains in several parts of this book very eloquently. So thank you to the people who've been here. And thank you, Charis Books, and also for great moderation, ER. And hopefully people will buy the book and Dominga's story will continue to live.
Yes, thank you both so much. This was a wonderful conversation and gift to everyone. So hope everybody stays safe and healthy, and that we'll get together again physically soon. So click this teal button if you like, and if you wish to donate to Charis Circle, our nonprofit, you certainly may do that, and we appreciate all of those gifts as well. That always helps us. That helps us pay for this platform and for the work that we do during the pandemic. Visit us online. We're really doing all of our holiday gift stuff online this year. So if you want to shop local or shop independent with Charis Books and More, we would love that. Our gift guide is right on our homepage. Yes, thank y'all, everyone. And
thank you.
Be well. Take care. Good night.